Sheriff Verdon joining us, who has now assembled the BTK task force. Sheriff Verdon, what do we know about his upbringing?
Well, the real story is his father was in the military when he was born. They lived in Columbus, Kansas. His father came back from service and returned to that area, and then moved from Columbus to Wichita for employment. And they moved to Wichita, I believe, somewhere when Dennis was 4 or 5 years old, and they were there. But one thing, unfortunately, from the last 11 months, I've learned a lot about Dennis Rader. Some things that really stick out to me from what she said. Dennis had went to California on his return back from overseas to military, so he had been in California when he returned in 70. Additionally, Mr. Otero's watch was taken. She mentioned he had a nice watch on that was a military type watch that was taken from Mr. Otero, and we know Dennis said he kept that watch for years. Addition to that, Mr. Otero had also been in the Air Force and had some relationships with people still there. So, when the time frame is that she's given us would have been shortly after that Otero murder. So, of course that would be on my mind as well, that he had just retired from the Air Force. He's missing a watch, and Dennis is describing from what it sounds, how gruesome the scene was at the Otero murder. So there's just so much with what she's brought forth. I hope to be able to meet with her soon, go over a lot of details. I know from going through a lot of the things that we've researched, he did have a lot of men's watches. There was a tremendous amount of jewelry recovered. So again, it's a good possibility. So, her story to me is very spot on, matches what I've learned. And again, I think there's possibilities that we might be able to confirm her being with him through, number one, the bag maybe that he had. He retained those things for a long time. We've got pictures and descriptions of watches. So I'm looking forward to looking harder into what happened to her. And again, the phone calls, there's other victims out there that we've learned had received different phone calls. Rader himself told me that, like the Oteros, he had called them at one point, basically confirming they were home and seeing if a male answered, stuff like that. So there's a lot here that is really huge to me.
Speaking of that, it's a signature in my mind, and I'd like to hear Cheryl and Dale jump in on this. And Gina, did you ever find that driver's license or that missing necklace or those missing clothes?
No.
What clothing specifically went missing?
It was and I had received it as a Christmas gift. It was a red bra.
A red bra?
It was a Christmas present of mine.
And the necklace, do you remember the necklace? What was that like?
Yes, it was on a long gold chain, and it was a circular that had several different rhinestones in it, like like kind of like a mother's ring or something. It was multicolored, like ruby, emerald, diamond, and it was in a cluster on a round circle.
And you mentioned the red bra, the necklace, and the driver's license. Did you ever find your driver's license?
Never.
It's very well known, Cheryl McCollum, that driver's licenses and jewelry and lingerie are prime souvenirs taken by serial killers. And we know BTK took all of these things from his victims.
Well, Jenna, would never left her purse without some place where anyone could have access to it. So what that argues is that she's correct. Someone was in the house and may even have been in the house when she was there asleep and the pocketbook fully unattended.
And Cheryl McCollum, we also know, speaking of the souvenirs, that he would toy with his victims. He would stalk them for a long time, call them, tamper with their phones, everything that Gina is saying. And I have no reason to doubt her because her story is very rich in detail.
It's very rich in detail. And like I said, I've had a chance to read her emails, to talk to her twice, now hear her again today. Her story has never changed. And one thing about Dennis Rader, I'd like to always point out, he gave himself a nickname. It could have been anything, but he picked BTK for bind, torture, kill. Those are action words. That's the order in what he did to his victims. It's a confession.
Okay, so what does that have to do with what I just asked you?
Because
about taking the souvenirs and how her story fits exactly in with other cases that he's already confessed to.
Because if you listen to the confessions, he tells you exactly what he did, what he took, what he kept. That's all public. That's how we know about the watch. So when he tells you what he's about, and then Ms. Rodriguez comes on and says, this is what he told me. This is the order that he wanted me to do something. It fits. He's telling her, I've got a bag, and nobody can see it. Nobody can hear it. We need to be alone. I've got tools in here that I'm going to use on you. That goes right to bind and torture.
You know what's interesting?
He just basically saves her life.
Another interesting point, and I want to circle back to him musing about should his moniker be the poetic strangler, because he wrote and recited a poem to Gina on her last known conversation with him over the phone, where he mentioned something about roses are red, panties are pink, missing third line, and without you, I'll be blue, something to that effect. Is that normal for BTK? Sheer Verdon, is it true that he wanted to be considered being called the poetic strangler?
He came up with many different options for himself and then settled on BTK. Again, we know his relations with threes, triangles. BTK is a three, and that's the one he chose, and we believe it's because of his fascination with the eternal triangle and kind of the whole basis of how he lived his life. To this day, when three comes up, he gets excited. So I think he settled with BTK simply because of the threes. But he considered many things, trying to figure out what would best suit him.
What do you make of that, Dr. Joni Johnson, that he wished to be known as the, quote, poetic strangler? That's quite the dichotomy.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think that just hearing the conversation he had with law enforcement, or this idea of what am I going to call myself, I think it just speaks to an incredible amount of narcissism, in terms of just, and also, unfortunately, the level of enjoyment I think he's experiencing around this. I mean, I think this really did consume his life, even though he led his life in somewhat of a dichotomy. I think he really was thinking about this all the time.
To Dale Carson, the dichotomy of wanting to be known as the poetic strangler. This guy's a brutal killer. He'll wipe out a whole family and then dress himself up in their clothes and bind himself with ropes. I don't know how he did it. One, he was practically hanging upside down and then took Polaroid photos of himself. I mean, why would he want to be known as anything connected to poetry?
Well, the many cases that I've handled dealing with sex offenders reflects that they have a fairly broad range of interests. and they're willing to try most anything. They're very curious people from my perspective. And it's fascinating that when they engage in this activity, they want to memorialize it, and hence the use of photographs so that they can look at themselves, looking at themselves. I've actually seen photographs of individuals looking at themselves 3 times in the same different photograph with mirrors. So there's a lot of pleasure derived from that, revisiting the pleasure that they receive from their behavior, even if it's just to themselves. So his behavior doesn't surprise me at all.